1 Corinthians. We're in our series on 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 3. Some things we may have heard over the years. Act your age, not your shoe size. Or act your age, not your IQ. Yes, yes. Do you want to be treated like an adult? Then act like an adult. Or if you want to be treated like an adult, quit acting like a kid. Stop acting like a baby. Those are all I can think of. Anybody think of any other child-ish remarks? Only good ones I could think of. None that you can say in church. That's well put, Larry. Don't be childish. These are all behavioral comments concerning childlike behavior. Teenagers sometimes act childish. Adults sometimes act childish. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines childish as having or showing the unpleasant qualities that children often have. Now, they don't say what those unpleasant qualities are. What are some of those unpleasant qualities that we deem childish? Whining, that's a good one. Throwing a fit, selfishness. Those are three really good ones. Whining, throwing a fit, and selfishness. Those are really, really good ones. People act childish, and I think we all have times when we act childish at one time or another. And hopefully we can keep our childlike behavior, not childlike, childish behavior to a minimum. Because childish behavior affects all areas of life, including church life. Do people act childish in church? Yes! Yes, if you've never witnessed that firsthand, just wait. Just wait. Does your pastor sometimes act childish? I hope not, but I'm sure I do. You could ask my wife. Yes. This morning, Paul is going to tell us what are the implications, what are the ramifications, what does it do to a church, what does it do to us personally when we act childish, when childish behavior becomes an issue in the church. What happens? And what do we do about it? So that's what we're going to look at this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, okay? And we're going to look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 17 this morning. Now, I'm essentially going to walk verse by verse through this. We really haven't done that so far in 1 Corinthians. We've done a lot of summarizing, but we're really going to walk more or less verse by verse through this. So let's start here. I'm going to break this down section by section, and we're going to read verses 1 through 4 to start with. But I, brothers and sisters, Paul, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you are not ready. For you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, you are not of the flesh and behaving only... it's a question. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not being merely human? Or are you not acting more or less childish, okay? So Paul says, I can't even address you, the Corinthians, as spiritual people, verse 1. I can't address you as spiritual people. What is it? Those of you who have the NIV, what's the NIV say? Does it say spiritual people there in verse 1? Okay, I can't address you as spiritual. They are spiritual in the sense of they have the Holy Spirit in them. If you're a believer, you have the Holy Spirit. We talked about that last week. But something is lacking in their life. They are not the spiritual people that Paul wants them to be. Now, this very well they're not the natural person. Back up to verse 14. What does verse 14 say in the NIV of chapter 2? The natural person or the... Verse 14, does it say anything different? Okay, the man without the Spirit, all right? So they're acting natural. They're acting like they don't have the Spirit. They're lacking something, okay? They don't have, chapter 2, verse 16, the mind of Christ. They don't have that. And we talked about that last week. They don't have the mind of Christ. Their lives are not being modeled after Christ, okay? They're Christians. they have the Holy Spirit, but they're not acting like it. It's not looking like it. They don't have the mind of Christ. We can say that they have the Spirit, but the Spirit really isn't in charge of their lives. Okay? The Spirit isn't in the driver's seat, if you want to put that like that. So Paul says they are still people who are driven by their unhealthy desires. Verse 2, I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it, and even now you are not ready. What are some things that are going on? Well, they're acting childish. There's jealousy. There's strife. There's all sorts of things going on. And Paul says, he's urging them for a change in perspective. Okay, he's not changing their diet per se. He's not asking them to change necessarily from the elementary teachings of the faith to more advanced teachings of the faith. He said, you need to change a perspective. You need to be moving your mind around. You need to be having that mind of Christ. Now, this is really a looming issue for many Christians, I think. For all of us at one time or another. Just childishness, acting childish. We all act childish at times because we fall prey to our sinful desires. We fall prey to our egos. We fall prey to our selfishness. We fall prey to those things that aren't Spirit-filled, that aren't Spirit-like, that aren't, as verse 16 of chapter 2, that don't bring us into the mind of Christ, that don't represent the cross. We fall prey to those things. Sometimes we have legitimate disagreements that are fine to have in the church, but we handle them in childish ways. Have you seen that? Have you seen people discuss things that really should be discussed? Things that are important within the church, but they handle disagreements in childish ways. We don't have time to get into that, but I think we know what that is. You can have disagreements handled in unhealthy ways, can't we? We throw tantrums. What was the other one? We're selfish. We whine. We still do that sometimes, okay? So we can deal with healthy agreements in unhealthy manners at times. And if you look back at James, you don't need to turn there, but James says, what are your problems? What's your problem? Okay? You're fighting, you're quarreling, and this is James chapter 4. What causes fights and what causes quarrels among you? Is it not that your passions, or is it not that your inner desires are at war within you? You want things, but you don't get them. That's what causes the problems, okay? Selfishness, egoism, okay? And we all fall prey to that, okay? And this indicates that we're sort of focused on Christ, but we're sort of focused on ourselves. And that still happens, doesn't it? As Christians, we can still be sort of focused on Christ and sort of focused on ourselves. I think that's the way we often function. And I think this reveals the fact, or reveals the importance of that our personal spiritual life affects the spiritual health of the church. Okay? Our individual spiritual lives impact the spiritual health of the church as a whole. Does that make sense? That our own spiritual lives aren't disconnected from the life of the church. When the whole church is unhealthy on an individual level, the church isn't going to be healthy. You can't throw a bunch of unhealthy spiritual people together and expect things to be all beautiful and work out well. But the health of individuals impacts the health of the church. Now, that doesn't mean that when one person is down, the other people in the church don't lift him or her up. That we're not on different levels spiritually. But in general, that each individual's spiritual growth and spiritual development is important for the overall health and the overall growth of the church. We're going to return to that a little bit. And Paul's going to return to it later in 1 Corinthians, that you can't have a healthy body if the heart malfunctions. You can't have a healthy body if the lungs don't work right. That's similar to what's going on in the church. Every piece of the church, every person in the church needs to be functioning healthy spiritually for the whole thing to work well. So what all is going on here? Well, their immaturity, this childishness, has affected their ability to judge. If you look back at chapter 2, verse 15, the spiritual person judges all things, has affected their ability to judge their leaders, to judge what is right and wrong. They think they are wise, but they are foolish. Paul says they are adults. They think they're adults, but they're infants. It's like the young guy, he's 22. He says, when I turned 20, my dad's advice finally started making sense. Dad finally understood what was going on. Who finally got things figured out? The kid. It's not the dad. The dad had good advice all along. It's just when we get to a certain age, we realize, oh, mom and dad actually knew what they were talking about. Paul knows what he's talking about, but these people are still infants, and they need a change in perspective. And Paul reminds them, you're bickering, you're fighting, you're acting childish. You can't judge your leaders. And so he reminds them about what are leaders? If you're bickering over your leadership, if you're bickering among each other, if you're being selfish, if your leaders are being selfish, if they're being ego-driven and self-centered, well, what are leaders? What are leaders in the first place? And this is where he moves into verse 5. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one. Each will receive his wages according to his labor, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. So what are the leaders in the church? Paul says, all they are servants. That's all I am, Paul speaking. He said, I'm just a servant. The guy who followed me, Apollos, he's just a servant. If you track with that, Paul, verse 6, he planted the church in Corinth, and Apollos followed him. You can go look in Acts 18 and 19 if you want to follow that up after church. But Paul came first. Apollos followed him, picked up on the work he did. But Paul says, we're not really anything. All we are is servants. Your leaders now, all they are servants. Why are you bickering? Why are you following one and not following the other? Why are you divided over your leadership? They're not rock stars. You shouldn't be treating them as if they're famous people or anything like that. They're just your servants. They're servants of Christ, okay? And so Paul downplays his importance, Apollos' importance, and the importance of their current leaders. Paul nor Apollos is there anymore. He says, your leaders are just servants. Don't lose sight of who your leaders are. They're only servants, okay? And it's not them who do anything anyway. Paul places the growth, using plant imagery here. Paul places the growth solely in God. Verse 7, neither he who plants or he who waters is anything. Paul, he says, I'm nothing. Apollos, he's nothing. Your current leaders are nothing. It's God who's doing the growth. Verse 7. All right? They are the ones God is the one who is doing the work here, who is causing the growth, not your leaders. So don't place too much importance in them and too much emphasis on them. And so Paul changes the metaphor in verse 9, okay? He's talking about, he's using more farm or plant metaphors, and then he moves to more of a building metaphor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. Now the new metaphor, God's building, okay? The concept there is the Corinthians are still under construction. Corinthians are still being built. They're not there yet. They're not complete. God's workers working on the Corinthian church, okay? So let's continue here and track where Paul is going with this in his changed metaphor, all right? Verses 10 through 15. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation. Someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. That's what happens when you don't follow along with your finger. You start reading things over again. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. And you could put a she in there too, not just he's. So Paul, in verse 10, pictures himself as the contractor. Okay? He's like, what's a contractor do at a building site? Morgan, what's a contractor do at a building site? Yeah, he manages. He oversees the design. He's not the architect, but he oversees kind of the crew, the subcontractors. He oversees the building as it goes up. And Paul pictures himself as the contractor here. He put down the foundation. And what is this foundation according to Paul? Verse 11. What's the foundation that Paul has laid? Jesus Christ. I have laid the foundation. The foundation is Jesus Christ. Okay? And he says then in verse 10, let each one take care how he builds upon it. Now at this point he's addressing every person in the church. Okay? Anybody within your church that works in ministry, that utilizes his or her spiritual gifts, be careful how you build on the foundation. And the foundation is what? Jesus Christ, okay? Track with us on this building metaphor here. Okay? Anybody in the church that does anything, anybody that works, anybody that leads, anybody that teaches, anybody that sets up our chairs in the morning or cleans the toilet, whatever you do, make sure you're building on the foundation correctly, all right? We're going to get back to that in just a moment. And then here Paul lists, verse 12, some building materials, okay? And he's got two categories. He's got gold, silver, and precious stones, and that's not really so much like gems, like diamonds and things. It's like marble, okay? Marble the foremost. You know, you build with marble. Marble was the stone of choice. Okay, and then he's got another category, wood, hay, and straw. Now, how do you separate those two? What are those two categories then? Gold, silver, and marble, and then wood, hay, and straw. What's the difference between those two? Hard and soft. What are some other differentiations there? Yeah, one burns. Paul's going to get to that in just a moment. It reminds me, what little, does this remind you of any? Three Little Pigs. Yes, it does, doesn't it? The Three Little Pigs. What do the first two pigs build with? What's the first pig built with? Straw. What's the second pig built with? Sticks. What happened to those two houses? The big bad wolf blows them down. And where do the three, well, depending on which version you read, the two little pigs either get eaten up or they go run to the third house, which is made out of what? Made out of brick. The same thing is going on here. The first category is that which lasts. That's what will withstand time. Or more to the point, as Tony pointed out, who will withstand fire. The last three, you can erect something with those things, but it's not going to last. It's not going to last. I had a friend that went to, is it England? No, Paris. And she said, walking through Paris, you see these buildings that are 600, 700, 800 years old, 1,000 years old, built out of stone. And you come here and, something's good if it lasts 100 years. It's just the time difference is amazing and how long those buildings last. They build them out of stone, out of marble. Paul says, be careful what you build with. You can build out of things that last. You can construct on the foundation of Jesus Christ with things that last or not. You can build with hay, straw. Now let's dig into this a little bit more because Paul isn't particularly clear here. He doesn't, the metaphor is fine, but he doesn't tell us, well, how do we build well? What are things that we do that represent gold, silver, marble? And what kind of building represents straw, hay, and wood? What are your thoughts on that? How do we build? What work do we do represents the things that last and what sort of work within the church represents the things that won't last. You have any thoughts on that? Okay, fellowship will last. Okay. Yeah, good one, Dan. What else? Anything that builds the kingdom? Yeah. Dawn? Okay.
Now there might be 5 people. Okay. However, that church supports 13 missionaries.
Okay.
That's been doing this for years. So even though the numbers have dwindled, the people have passed away, they've moved, whatever, the church is making a huge impact, even though there's nobody in the pew.
Okay.
So it's how big the church is, other than just the people sitting in it, and that the pews are to build on one year or so.
So what, can we boil that down even more? What has that church done? I'm looking for kind of a certain word there. They have outreach. They've kind of invested in other people. They've, fellowship or outreach. That they've looked beyond themselves. Remember the childish things? What do childish people or kids, what does their world revolve around? Self, yeah, me. Okay? It revolves around me. But I think that which lasts invests in other people. It invests in kingdom, Linda. It builds kingdom relationships. And it does it with grace and mercy, not out of a desire to put people in the pews. But it does outreach not to have bigger numbers, but it does outreach because it cares that people come to Christ or not. Not so the church can be recognized by the district because it grew, but because it seeks to enlarge Christ's kingdom. Any other ideas on what does a church do, or what do we do as individuals to build well, to build with gold, silver, or marble, as opposed to building with straw? We hit some good ones. I suppose a church, thinking through this, can a church build with straw, like with guilt? Guilting yourself into doing things, or guilting its people into doing things? I think churches can do that. And that won't last. Guilt eventually wears off, doesn't it? But when you build with the heart, when you build out of a desire to love Christ, that lasts, okay? That lasts the tests of time, okay? So let's see. The whole purpose of this, Tony has mentioned, is that, verse 13, this day, this final day, capitalize F and the D, this final day will disclose the work because it will be tested by fire, okay? The building that we build, the church, is going to be tested by fire, and some of it's going to be burned up, and some of it's going to last. Those first things, gold, silver, and marble, could withstand fire. Hay, straw, and wood cannot. And fire was a big concern for ancient cities. How fast a city could be destroyed with fire if it was built out of wood. You think of the Great Chicago Fire. London had a major fire. Lisbon had a major fire in 1755 after an earthquake. Entire cities could be burnt to the ground with fire. Okay, and so fire was feared, and Paul pulls that out. Okay, that everything we do is going to be tested, both as individuals and as a church. That which we build is going to be tested by fire. Okay? And the reward of this isn't salvation. Okay? I want us to be very clear on that. Paul talks about a reward, verse 14. If the work anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. That's not salvation. You can't, you don't lose it through that any more than you gain it through building, okay? So I want us to make sure we're clear on that poor work cannot lose salvation any more than good work can gain it, okay? So we're not talking about salvation here, but Paul just says a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So the imagery here is the person is snatched out in the nick of time just before the building collapses upon him or her. They may have their eyebrows and their hair singed off, but they are saved at the last minute, okay? So what's a reward? Paul isn't clear. My thoughts on this are, and these are just my thoughts, is the reward is simply being able to see one's work last to eternity. You can see the work that you have engaged in through life last, or you can see it disappear and kind of crumble like ash through your hands. There was a building in the city that I grew up in, the town that I grew up in. It was, we watched them for a few months. They erected this building out of wood, and they had they had put the roof on, and then they put the pallets of shingles, the boxes of shingles up on the roof, getting ready to shingle. And the next day we drove by, and the entire thing had collapsed. Nobody wanted, and so imagine they built it up again, and you know what? That building sat there for a couple years before it sold. Who wants to buy a building that had collapsed once? Everybody in town knew, oh yeah, that's the building that collapsed. That's kind of the sense. No builder wants to look at their building, and I'm proud to say that my building collapsed. That's kind of the sense, I think, somewhat, that nobody wants to get to the end of their life and see that all that they have worked for is of nothing. Reward is seeing that the things that you have done are of eternal value, that I've invested in people, that I've invested in kingdom things, invested in Christ. So, Paul encourages us to work for things that will last. And then he wraps up, verse 16 and 17. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. So Paul reminds them, this is a group effort. Okay? This is a group effort here. As much as this is addressed to each individual person, and we tend to be individually oriented, even though this so much isn't, every single person's work counts to this. But don't forget that this is a group effort. Okay? Paul says the entire church, you whole Corinthian church, are the temple of God. Now later, he's going to individualize it and say each person is the temple. But here, that's not the case. Here, the you is plural. You as a church are the temple of God, and that God's Spirit dwells within you. Okay? And that's same for the Corinthians church. That's same for our church here. New Heights is God's temple. God dwells in us as a church. And this is clearly a warning, because what does he say to those who destroy God's temple? What will God do to those who destroy God's temple? He will destroy him or her or them. We get so concerned, churches get so concerned about external threats on the church. What's our culture doing to our church? Look how the culture is influencing our church. And there's truth to that. Paul's going to hit on that. But in this point, Paul is concerned with internal threats, that the church will be destroyed from the inside out, that it will rot from the inside, if you want to put it that way. And those people will be judged harshly. And it's not people who build poorly. It's not people who use straw, wood, and hay, but it's people who intentionally destroy the church. People who divide the church. People who split the church into factions. People who look to cause problems, if you will. Okay? God doesn't really have a whole lot of time for that. So why should we care how the church is built? Now again, what's the church? The church is people, right? We're not talking about a physical building. Again, this is all metaphor. Okay, this is imagery. Why should we care how the church is built? What difference does it make? Because we got to make this a little bit relevant. Well, because the building of the church has direct implications for the next life. We can get so caught up in talking about going to heaven that we lose sight of the fact and the reality that the things that we do here and now have relevance for the next life. This isn't playground for the next life. I'm not even so sure it's preparation for the next life. There's so much that carries through for what we do here into the next life. Realities that pass between the two, people in whom we invest, work that makes a difference. So what does this mean? Well, what it means is that we can't pass off building the church as somebody else's job. That's Rosie's job. I'm not going to fiddle with this. That's Rosie's job. Like Jumpstart, that's Lauren Morgan's thing. I don't need to get involved in that. Or when problems arise, pastors like to blame congregations. That's the congregation's fault. They didn't treat me very well. They didn't pay me enough. Whatever. It means that pastors don't blame their congregation when things get rough. It also means that congregations don't necessarily blame their pastors when things get rough. Both are probably at fault some of the time. But what? Instead of blaming each other, this teacher got mad at that teacher. Didn't like the donuts Lewis brought this morning. Should have brought sprinkles. Yeah. It's that we're all in this together. We all build together. We're all part of this together. That's part of Paul's underlying assumption here. Is that we're all in this together. We all build. This isn't somebody else's job. Everyone builds the church. Everybody is part of the labor crew. Okay? Everybody is on a work crew. Whether you're putting on the roof, whether you're putting in the electricity, whether you're mending the fences, whatever it is. And that's one of the neat things about this letter. Go back and reread the introduction. Paul, if say another church here in town was having problems, okay? Say the church down the street is having problems, and you write a letter. Who are you going to address that letter to, probably? Yeah, you're probably going to say, Pastor John, I'm upset with what is going on. If you look at the beginning of Corinthians, who is this letter addressed to? To whom is this letter addressed? Somebody look at that. What? The whole church, isn't it? Everybody. Paul doesn't take their pastor to task, or their pastors probably. He doesn't take their leadership to task here per se. He does. But the whole letter is addressed to the church. You guys are having problems. This is a church-wide issue. Everybody is involved in this. Everybody is building, okay? This is a whole church issue. That's a point that often goes missed, that the letter here is addressed to everybody here in the church. And I think is very, very important. So the entire church is part of this mission that God has given us. Everybody builds. Everybody, Paul's going to get to this, use their spiritual gift. Everybody engage. Because our individual work is going to be called the task for what we do, how we build. The whole church is going to be called the task for what we do and how we build. We all build this together. We all build new heights together. We build on the foundation of Christ because we are God's temple. All right? We are God's temple. Be careful how you build that temple. That we build out of fear, but out of joy and out of hope and out of love and out of grace. That God, is going to see what lasts and what doesn't. That we all build this church together.